In the spring of 1862, along the red clay banks of the Tombigbee River in Greene County, Alabama, 5 white men disappeared over the course of 3 weeks. Their bodies were discovered scattered across neighboring cotton plantations, each mutilated beyond recognition, each bearing the marks of methodical rage. The killing sent shockwaves through the planter aristocracy of the Black Belt, exposing not just a crime of unprecedented brutality, but the festering wound of a system that had long ago crossed the threshold from exploitation into something far more monstrous. At the center of this horror stood a woman whose name would be whispered in equal measures of terror and awe, Hattie, a 26-year-old enslaved woman who had watched her younger brother die beneath the lash and had decided that some debts could only be repaid in blood. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories from the slave-holding states, stories that reveal the true moral cost of a society built on human bondage. The Waverly Plantation sat like a cathedral of cotton wealth 12 miles south of Eutaw, Alabama, a sprawling estate of nearly 4,000 acres worked by 217 enslaved souls. The Great House, a Greek Revival monument to antebellum excess, rose 3 stories high with white columns that gleamed in the merciless Alabama sun. Its master, Colonel Marcus Treadwell, was a third-generation planter who had inherited both land and the peculiar institution from his father, a man known throughout Greene County as much for his Methodist piety as for his merciless treatment of those he claimed as property. At 48 years old, Colonel Treadwell embodied the contradictions of the Southern planter class, educated at the University of Virginia, well-versed in the classics, a devoted husband to his Charleston-born wife Catherine, and utterly convinced of his divine right to own other human beings. His neighbors respected him. His church elevated him to elder. His slaves feared him with a terror that went bone deep. Catherine Treadwell, 39 years old, and the daughter of a prominent South Carolina Rice dynasty, presided over the domestic realm of Waverly with the same iron discipline her husband applied to the fields. She had been raised to believe that slavery was a benevolent institution, that the African race required the guidance of their superiors, that the great plantations of the South represented civilization's highest achievement. She taught Sunday school to the slave children, distributed extra rations at Christmas, and convinced herself that these small mercies absolved her of complicity in the daily violence that made her lifestyle possible. She had given Colonel Treadwell 3 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom had been taught to regard the enslaved population as one might regard livestock, useful, occasionally troublesome, but ultimately property to be managed rather than people to be understood. Among the 217 souls held in bondage at Waverly, several would become central to the tragedy that unfolded in that blood-soaked spring of 1862. Hattie was a woman of striking presence despite the degradation of her circumstances. 26 years old, she stood nearly 5 feet 9 inches tall, with dark skin that bore the scars of previous punishments and eyes that plantation visitors described as unsettlingly direct. She had been born on Waverly, the daughter of a field hand named Sarah and a father whose identity was spoken of only in whispers, though some claimed he had been one of the Treadwell overseers. Hattie worked in the Great House as a parlor maid and laundress, a position that granted her proximity to the white family, but also exposed her to their casual cruelties and their unguarded conversations. She could read, a crime in Alabama law, taught secretly by her mother who had learned from a sympathetic overseer's wife decades earlier. This literacy made her dangerous in ways the Treadwells never suspected. Her younger brother, Isaac, was 19 years old that spring, a field hand of exceptional strength who worked the cotton rows from sunrise until the last light bled from the sky. He was known for his quick smile, his skill with horses, and his dangerous habit of looking white men in the eye when he spoke. This latter trait had earned him multiple whippings, but Isaac possessed a stubborn pride that even the lash could not fully extinguish. He and Hattie shared a bond forged in the particular hell of slavery, a connection that was both their greatest comfort and ultimately their doom. They would meet on Sunday afternoons by the old oak near the slave quarters, sharing what little food they had managed to save, speaking in low voices about a freedom that seemed as distant and impossible as the stars themselves. The overseer, a brutal Irishman named Liam Connolly, was 34 years old, and had worked at Waverly for 6 years. He was a man who had found in the slave system a license for sadism that his station in Ireland would never have permitted. He drank heavily, beat his own wife when the mood took him, and treated the enslaved population with a creativity and cruelty that shocked even some of the neighboring planters. Beside him worked 2 assistant overseers, James Pritchard, a 28-year-old Georgian with a fondness for the whip and a reputation for nocturnal visits to the women's quarters, and Samuel Burke, 42 years old, a transplanted Virginian who prided himself on his scientific approach to slave management, which meant detailed records of punishments administered and theories about breaking the spirit of rebellious slaves through systematic degradation. 2 neighboring planters would also factor into the horror. Robert Hartwell owned the adjacent plantation and was a frequent visitor to Waverly, a 51-year-old widower who had lost his wife to yellow fever and had since descended into alcoholism and casual violence. His friend Thomas Kincaid, 45 years old, was known throughout the county as a slave trader who specialized in the interstate trade, a man who had grown wealthy buying slaves in Virginia and Maryland and selling them to the cotton kingdoms of the Deep South. Both men shared Colonel Treadwell's conviction that the enslaved required constant surveillance and periodic examples of terror to maintain order, and both would learn too late that terror can flow in more than one direction. The trigger came on March 17, 1862, a Monday morning when the cotton fields were being prepared for spring planting. Isaac had been assigned to repair a section of fence along the northern boundary of Waverly, work that required him to use tools and work with less direct supervision than usual. He had completed the job by early afternoon and had committed the unforgivable sin of sitting down to rest in the shade before returning to report his completion of the task to Liam Connolly. The overseer, already drunk by midday, interpreted this rest as insolence, as evidence of that rebellious spirit he had long suspected in Isaac. What followed was not punishment but exhibition, a public spectacle designed to terrify and instruct. Connolly ordered Isaac stripped and tied to the whipping post in the center of the slave quarters, a spot deliberately chosen so that all 217 enslaved people would be forced to witness what happened to those who forgot their place. He sent word to Colonel Treadwell, to the assistant overseers, and to the neighboring planters that a lesson was about to be administered. By 4 in the afternoon, a crowd had gathered, the white men on horseback, forming a semicircle of judgment, the enslaved population forced to stand in the sun and watch, and Hattie pulled from her duties in the great house to witness her brother's destruction. The whipping began at 4:15. Connolly wielded the lash himself for the first 20 strokes, then handed it to Pritchard, who added 15 more. Burke took his turn for another 10 strokes, his face showing neither anger nor pleasure, only the cold calculation of a man conducting an experiment. Robert Hartwell and Thomas Kincaid each took turns, 5 strokes apiece, their participation a statement of solidarity with the plantation system that enriched them all. Colonel Treadwell stood watching, his arms crossed, his face impassive, saying nothing to stop the brutality and everything to endorse it. Isaac's back became a landscape of open flesh, blood streaming down to soak the earth beneath the post. He made no sound after the first dozen strokes, a silence that Connolly interpreted as defiance and that spurred him to order additional punishment. By the time they untied Isaac from the post, he could not stand. They left him there in the dirt, forbidden to be moved until morning, forbidden to be given water or medical attention, left to teach the watching enslaved population that mercy was not a currency in which masters trafficked. Hattie stood among the forced witnesses, her face a mask of stone, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her own palms. She did not weep, she did not cry out, she simply watched as her brother lay dying in the Alabama dust, and something inside her calcified into a purpose as hard and unyielding as iron. Pause for a moment and consider what kind of society transforms human beings into spectators of their own family's torture. What moral framework allows men to gather on horseback to watch another human being flayed alive, calling it justice, calling it necessary, calling it anything but the evil it truly was? Isaac died just before dawn on March 18. His body, still tied to the post through the night, had attracted flies and dogs. The infection from the wounds had spread with terrifying speed, the Alabama heat accelerating the sepsis that would have killed him even if the blood loss had not. Hattie was not permitted to touch him, not allowed to prepare his body, not given time to mourn. The enslaved population was roused at the usual hour, fed their usual inadequate rations, and sent to the fields as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Isaac's body was buried without ceremony in the slave cemetery beyond the cotton fields, his grave unmarked, his death unremarked upon, except as a line in the plantation ledger. Isaac, field hand, age 19, deceased March 18, 1862, cause punishment for insolence. But Hattie remarked upon it. In the 3 days following her brother's murder, she said nothing, showed nothing, performed her duties with the same efficiency she had always demonstrated. She laundered the Treadwell family's clothes, including the shirt Colonel Treadwell had worn to watch Isaac die. She served dinner in the great house dining room, while the family discussed the progress of the war, the price of cotton, the increasing difficulty of maintaining discipline among slaves who whispered about Lincoln's armies. She listened to Catherine Treadwell instruct her daughters on the proper way to manage household slaves, emphasizing firmness balanced with Christian charity, as if those words meant anything in a house built on Isaac's unmarked grave. On the night of March 21st, Hattie stole from the great house, with 3 items she had carefully gathered: a long kitchen knife normally used for butchering hogs, a coil of thin rope from the stables, and a small vial of laudanum that Catherine Treadwell kept in her medicine cabinet for her frequent headaches. She also carried something less tangible but infinitely more dangerous, the knowledge she had gained from years of listening to the Treadwells and their friends discuss plantation business, including the locations of property boundaries, the schedules of night patrols, and the habits of men who believed themselves invulnerable because they were white, because they were masters, because the entire structure of Southern society assured them that they were beyond accountability. If you have found this story challenging to hear, if it has stirred something in you about the true nature of slavery and the violence it both required and produced, then please subscribe to Shadows of the South. These are not comfortable histories, but they are necessary ones, stories that the antebellum South tried to bury and that contemporary society too often prefers to forget. We unearth them not for sensationalism, but for truth, for the understanding that only comes when we face the full horror of what was done in the name of property and profit. Liam Connolly was the first to die. On March 22, he left a tavern in Utah at approximately 10 in the evening, drunk as he usually was by that hour, riding his horse back toward Waverly, along the dark road that cut through pine forest and fields. Hattie had been waiting since dusk, hidden in a copse of trees where the road narrowed, a place she knew from having traveled it countless times on errands for the Treadwells. When Connolly passed, she stepped onto the road and called out in feigned distress, claiming to have been sent by Colonel Treadwell with an urgent message. Connolly, too drunk to question the improbability of this claim, dismounted to hear what she had to say. She offered him the laudanum-laced whiskey she had prepared, claiming the colonel had sent it as a gift for his good work. He drank greedily. Within 15 minutes, he was unconscious. She dragged him off the road, into the deeper darkness of the pine woods, and there she killed him, not quickly, but with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had thought extensively about justice and payment, and the weight of her brother's blood. When Connolly's body was discovered 3 days later by a search party, the men who found him became physically ill at the sight. He had been mutilated with a precision that suggested both rage and deliberation. The details were too horrific for the local newspaper to report fully, managing only to note that the deceased had been subjected to indignities that shocked all Christian sensibilities. The county sheriff, a planter himself named William Bradford, assumed initially that runaway slaves from a neighboring plantation were responsible, perhaps a group that had fled north and committed the crime in passing. It did not occur to him or to anyone else that a woman might be capable of such violence, or that someone from Waverly itself might have cause and opportunity to exact such revenge. James Pritchard died on March 28. He had been riding the boundary between Waverly and the Hartwell plantation, inspecting fence lines and checking for signs of escaped slaves. Hattie knew his route, because she had overheard him discussing it with Colonel Treadwell, knew that he rode alone in the early evening, knew that there was a particular stretch near an old tobacco barn, where the path was isolated and screened by overgrown magnolia trees. She waited there for 3 hours, patient as stone, and when Pritchard appeared, she used a different tactic. She had set a small fire in the tobacco barn, just enough to produce smoke, and when Pritchard investigated, she trapped him inside by barring the door from outside. The fire itself was never meant to kill him, only to confuse and disorient. When he finally broke through a window, bleeding and desperate, she was waiting with the rope. The details of what followed were again too disturbing for public record, but the search party that discovered him 4 days later reported that he bore wounds consistent with prolonged torture, that he had been alive for hours after his initial capture, and that his death had been neither quick nor merciful. Consider the transformation that slavery worked upon its victims, the way it took a young woman who had once smiled and sung in the slave quarters, and remade her into an instrument of vengeance, so complete that even hardened planters could not speak of what they found. This was not justice in any legal sense, but it was a response to a system that had made justice impossible, that had denied Isaac and Hattie, and all those like them, any recourse except submission or violence. The Greene County planter class was now thoroughly alarmed. 2 overseers dead within a week, both killed with unusual brutality, both discovered in locations that suggested intimate knowledge of plantation operations. Patrols were doubled. Night riders began sweeping the roads and forests, looking for runaways or suspicious gatherings. The slave quarters at every plantation were searched for weapons, for evidence of conspiracy. Many enslaved people suffered increased violence during this period, as the white population lashed out in fear and rage, administering preemptive punishments for crimes not yet committed. Colonel Treadwell ordered his own slaves confined to quarters after dark, posted armed guards, and consulted with neighboring planters about the possibility of organized resistance. Never once did suspicion fall on Hattie, who continued her work in the great house with the same quiet efficiency, who listened to their theories and their fears, and planned her next moves accordingly. Samuel Burke died on April 3. He had been traveling to Selma on business for Colonel Treadwell, carrying payment for a recent purchase of agricultural equipment. He rode with a pistol in his belt, alert to danger, confident in his ability to defend himself against any slave who might attempt robbery or assault. Hattie had learned his route by listening to the discussion at the Treadwell dinner table, had timed her own unauthorized absence from the plantation to coincide with his journey, and had prepared an ambush at a river crossing where travelers had to slow their horses to navigate the muddy banks. She used a fallen log to spook his horse, sending Burke tumbling into the shallow water, and in the confusion that followed, she struck him with a heavy branch, stunning him long enough to secure his hands and remove his weapon. What happened next, in the hours before he died, was never fully determined, but those who found his body spoke of wounds that could only have been inflicted over an extended period, of a death that had been drawn out with calculated precision. His money was untouched, his horse found grazing nearby, evidence that robbery had never been the motive. Robert Hartwell and Thomas Kincaid died together on April 9, a date that would later be recognized as particularly significant in Greene County, though the reasons would remain hidden for decades. The two men had been drinking at Waverly, celebrating news of a Confederate victory at some distant battlefield, congratulating themselves and Colonel Treadwell on their wisdom in having invested so heavily in cotton before the war, discussing the premium prices their crops would command once the blockade was broken. They left after midnight, riding together back toward Hartwell's plantation, both too drunk to notice they were being followed, too secure in their mastery to imagine they might be vulnerable. Hattie had taken a horse from the Waverly stables, a hanging offense in itself, and had tracked them along the dark road. When they stopped to relieve themselves in a grove of oak trees, she set upon them with a fury that seemed to draw from some bottomless well of rage. Hartwell died quickly, his throat cut before he could draw the pistol at his belt. Kincaid lived longer, long enough to understand what was happening, long enough to plead, long enough to offer money, freedom, anything if she would spare him. She did not spare him. When their bodies were found the next morning by a slave patrol, the scene was so horrific that 2 of the patrollers had to be treated for shock, and the county sheriff ordered the bodies removed and buried immediately, before word of the condition in which they were found could spread beyond the planter class. 5 white men dead in less than a month. The Black Belt of Alabama was in a state of near panic. Militias were formed. Every enslaved person on every plantation was subjected to interrogation, and often to torture in an attempt to extract confessions or information. Several innocent people were hanged on suspicion of involvement, their deaths meant to satisfy the white population's demand for swift justice and to serve as a warning against further violence. The local newspaper, the Utah Observer, published editorials warning of slave insurrection, comparing the killings to Nat Turner's rebellion, and demanding that the state government take extraordinary measures to prevent similar outbreaks. Ministers preached sermons about the inherent savagery of the African race, about the necessity of firm control, about the dangers of permitting literacy or any other form of education among the enslaved. The irony that their own brutality had created the very monster they now feared never seemed to occur to them, or if it did, they dismissed it as irrelevant sentimentality that had no place in the practical business of running a slave society. Hattie was finally discovered on April 12, not because of any investigative brilliance on the part of the authorities, but because of an accident of timing and the confession of a 12-year-old slave girl named Ruth, who had seen Hattie returning to the quarters in the early morning hours after one of the killings, her clothes stained with what might have been blood or mud, her expression so distant and cold that Ruth had been terrified into silence for weeks. When the girl finally spoke to her mother, and the mother reluctantly informed the house servants, and the house servants told the overseer, the machinery of white justice ground into motion with terrible speed. Colonel Treadwell ordered Hattie seized and confined to a locked smokehouse, while he consulted with the sheriff and with other planters about how to proceed. The legal proceedings that followed were a farce of justice, a trial held in the Utah courthouse that lasted less than 3 hours, and that was attended by a crowd of white men who had already determined her guilt and were present only to witness the formality of sentencing. Hattie did not deny what she had done. When asked by the judge, a 60-year-old planter named Augustus Thornton, who had owned slaves his entire life and had never questioned the morality of the institution, whether she had killed those 5 men, she answered clearly, and without emotion, that she had. When asked why, she spoke the only word she would utter during the entire proceeding: "They killed my brother." The courtroom erupted in shouts and threats, men leaping to their feet to demand immediate execution, to suggest methods of death that would serve as lasting warnings to any other slaves who might harbor similar thoughts of revenge. Judge Thornton gavelled for order and sentenced Hattie to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week, with her body to be displayed publicly as a deterrent. The speed of the execution was deliberate, designed to prevent any possibility of appeal or intervention, though from whom such intervention might have come in a slave state at war to preserve slavery was never clear. Stop and reflect on the symmetry of it. Isaac killed for resting, for the sin of being tired,
his death witnessed by 200 people who were forced to watch and forbidden to weep. Hattie killed for demanding payment for that death, her trial witnessed by 200 people who were eager to watch and who would cheer at her execution. In both cases, the state and society called it justice, called it law, called it anything but murder. The execution took place on April 18, 1862, in the public square in Utah, on a gallows constructed specifically for the occasion. Nearly 800 people attended, drawn from across Greene County and beyond, white families, who brought their children to witness the spectacle, planters who came to see justice done, and to reassure themselves that their authority remained intact, preachers who offered prayers for Hattie's soul, while simultaneously justifying her death as necessary for the preservation of social order. The enslaved population was also compelled to attend, hundreds of black faces forced once again to watch as the system demonstrated its power over life and death, forced to internalize the lesson that resistance, even justified resistance, even resistance born of grief and rage, would always end at the end of a rope. Hattie walked to the gallows without assistance, her head held high, her face showing neither fear nor regret. She wore the same plain dress she had worn during her trial, her hands bound before her, her feet chained to prevent any last attempt at escape. The sheriff read the charges and the sentence while the crowd jeered and shouted, calling her monster, demon, savage, every epithet that allowed them to forget that she was human, that she had been sister and daughter, that she had loved and lost and acted from a grief so profound that it had transformed her into something beyond their understanding. When offered the opportunity to speak final words, to confess her sins and beg forgiveness from God, and from the white society she had wronged, Hattie looked out over the crowd of white faces and said nothing. Her silence was more eloquent than any speech could have been, a final refusal to participate in the ritual of her own degradation. She died at 10:47 in the morning, the rope breaking her neck instantly, her body convulsing for less than a minute before hanging still in the April sun. The crowd cheered. Prayers were offered thanking God for deliverance from evil. Colonel Treadwell, who had attended with his entire family, nodded in satisfaction, and spoke to neighboring planters about the necessity of firm discipline and swift justice. Catherine Treadwell held her daughters close, using the execution as an object lesson about the dangers of being too lenient with slaves, about the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between the races, about the animal nature that lurked beneath even the most civilized-seeming Negro. The Treadwell sons, ranging in age from 8 to 16, watched with expressions ranging from horror to fascination to a dawning understanding that the world they inhabited was built on foundations of violence that could never be fully hidden or fully acknowledged. Hattie's body was left hanging for 3 days as required by the sentence, a rotting monument to white power and black subjugation. When finally cut down, it was not returned to Waverly for burial in the slave cemetery beside her brother, but was instead thrown into an unmarked pit beyond the town limits, denied even the minimal dignity of a grave. The authorities feared that any marked burial site might become a shrine, a place where enslaved people might gather to remember not Hattie's crimes, but her courage, not her violence, but her love for her brother and her refusal to accept that his death was somehow legal, somehow justified, somehow anything but murder. The story of Hattie and Isaac and the 5 men who died is not comfortable history. It does not offer easy moral lessons or simple villains and heroes. It forces us to confront the reality that slavery created conditions in which normal human responses to grief and injustice became crimes punishable by death, in which the defense of family became murder, in which the only path to justice led through blood. It reminds us that the antebellum South's vision of itself as a civilized society built on Christian principles and natural hierarchy was a delusion, a lie told to justify the unjustifiable, a pretty story wrapped around a core of violence and exploitation that eventually consumed those who participated in it, both black and white, though again in vastly different measures, and with vastly different degrees of culpability. These stories matter because they reveal the true price of power without accountability, of a social order built on the premise that some human beings are inherently worth less than others, of a legal system that exists to protect property rather than people. They matter because the structures of thought that made slavery possible, that allowed good Christians like Colonel Treadwell and Catherine Treadwell to participate in atrocity while convincing themselves they were benevolent, did not disappear with emancipation. They evolved, adapted, found new expressions in Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and the persistent racial inequalities that plague American society to this day. Understanding Hattie's rage, and Isaac's death and the willful blindness of the white society that created the conditions for both is essential to understanding the long shadow that slavery continues to cast over American life. If this story has moved you, if it has challenged your understanding of the antebellum South and the realities of slavery that too often get sanitized in popular memory, then consider what other stories remain buried in the archives of county courthouses and plantation records. What other Hatties and Isaacs lived and died in obscurity, their resistance forgotten or deliberately erased. This is the work of Shadows of the South to unearth these histories, to refuse the comfortable lies that the slave-holding states told about themselves, to insist on the full truth of what was done in the name of cotton and profit and racial hierarchy. Please share this story, not because it is easy to hear, but because it is necessary to remember. The dead deserve at least that much, their stories told honestly, their suffering acknowledged, their humanity recognized even when their own society refused to do so.